My name is Lionel Baxter. I'm 57 years old, and I want to tell you about the afternoon my son-in-law handed me a microphone in front of his entire company, the company I built, and then watched the room go completely still. Not because of anything I'd said yet. Because Bridget from HR had just pulled up a document on the screen behind him, and 40 people could read exactly whose name was on the retained interest clause at the bottom of the shareholder agreement. My daughter had asked me, more than once, to keep things smooth, to not make it awkward. I'd done my best. I sat through his dinners, I listened to his theories, I drove 2 hours from Sudbury to their place in Barrie for Thanksgiving, and stood in the kitchen holding a glass of cider I didn't really want. I let it go, again and again, because that's what you do when the person you love asks you to. But when he put 36 people's livelihoods on a slide deck and called it operational optimization, that was a different calculation entirely. Before I go any further, if this story means something to you, hit like, leave a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. I read every single one. Now let me take you back to where this really started. I grew up in Garson, a small community just east of Sudbury. If you're not from Northern Ontario, you've probably never heard of it. My father worked the smelter at Falconbridge for 31 years. He came home smelling like sulfur, ate supper without complaint, and went back the next morning. That was his life, and he didn't apologize for it. I started operating heavy equipment at 19, excavators, bulldozers, graders. I learned fast and worked hard, and I was good at it. But what I wanted was to run my own jobs, not spend my life finishing someone else's. At 34, I started Baxter Site Solutions out of a rented yard on the edge of the city. One used Cat 320, 2 employees, and a contract to clear a residential subdivision that barely covered the fuel costs. My wife Anne thought I'd lost my mind. She supported me anyway, every single day. 20 years later, we had 63 people on payroll. Civil construction, earthworks, site prep for mining developments, municipal contracts across the Sudbury Basin and up into the Nipissing district. People from Garson, Chelmsford, Valley East. People who'd grown up the same way I had, whose dads had worked the mines, who needed steady work, and a boss who knew their names and asked after their families. When Anne got sick, I kept the company running. I had to. The work kept me standing. She passed when our daughter Simone was 17. It's the kind of loss that doesn't get smaller. You just learn to carry it differently. At 52, I sold 65% of Baxter Site Solutions to Trillium Infrastructure Partners, a Toronto-based investment firm. They came in with a new name on the sign, Trillium Baxter Construction, fresh corporate branding, new letterhead. But I kept 35%, a seat on the advisory board, and one specific clause in the shareholder agreement that my lawyer, Edgar, said was unusual for a transaction of this size. I told him it was the condition of the deal. They signed it. I don't think anyone in their office read it the way Edgar and I had written it. Section 8.2. Any reduction in active field workforce exceeding 15 positions requires prior written consent from the retained interest holder. That was me. It had always been me. Simone met Jarrett at a networking event in Toronto this spring after she turned 28. She called me that same evening, voice a little higher than usual, the way it got when she was trying to play something casual. He had an MBA from Queens. He worked in infrastructure operations consulting. He had a plan for everything. She said it like it was the most impressive thing she'd ever heard. I met him 3 months later at a restaurant on King Street West. He had a firm handshake and the kind of eyes that are always doing a quick calculation. He asked me polite questions, and then spent most of dinner answering them himself. Simone looked at him like he was the only light source in the room. I told myself what I needed to tell myself. She's happy. That's what matters most. They got married when Simone was 31. I walked her down the aisle and shook Jarrett's hand at the altar. His grip was confident. His eyes moved twice around the room before the ceremony started. The first year he was fine, cordial. Showed up to occasions, asked about my knee, remembered things. The second year was different. He started correcting me at the dinner table. Gently at first, then less so. If I mentioned something about earthwork logistics, he'd redirect. Actually, the current model works differently. If I brought up anything about the old business, he'd nod the way a professor nods at a student who almost got there. Simone would catch my eye across the table. I'd let it go. Here's what you need to understand. 2 years after the acquisition closed, Trillium brought my son-in-law in as director of field operations. His onboarding documents referred to the original ownership as the founding group. Clean, standard language and private equity paperwork. No mention of my name. No mention of where the company started or what it had cost to build. He had no idea he was coming into my house. Thanksgiving, that October. We were at their place in Barrie, a nice house in a subdivision on the south end, the kind with granite countertops and a double garage. Simone had made her mother's apple pie from the recipe I still have taped inside a cupboard door at home. Their son Max, 8 years old, sat beside me at the table and spent most of dinner telling me about a hockey player I'd never followed. I didn't mind. I liked listening to him. My son-in-law was talking about work, quarterly projections, an upcoming restructure he was calling the efficiency review. He used a lot of words that meant things and a few that didn't. At some point, he mentioned consolidating the field crew roster. I set down my fork. Those are people with families, I said. Not an argument, just a fact. He looked at me, then at Simone, then leaned back in his chair with the particular smile of a man who believes he's being patient. Dad, he said. He'd started calling me that in year 2, which I'd never asked for. With respect, I wouldn't bring on someone with your background in today's market. No formal credentials, no project management certification, no real framework for how modern infrastructure operations are run. He picked up his wine glass. You built something in a different era. That era is gone. The table went quiet. Max stopped talking about hockey. Simone looked at her plate. I picked up my fork. I finished dinner. I helped carry dishes to the kitchen, kissed my daughter goodnight, crouched down and said goodbye to Max. I shook Jarrett's hand at the door. I drove the 2 hours back to Sudbury on the 400 North. I didn't turn on the radio. Simone called that night. He didn't mean it like that, Dad. Please don't make this into something. Okay, I said. I didn't make it into something, not yet. 6 weeks later, my son-in-law called on a Thursday afternoon. We're doing a quarterly all-hands next Friday in Sudbury, he said. I'd like you to come down, as family. I think it'd be good for you to see the operation. He paused the way he always did after a sentence like that, letting the implications settle. I said yes. I didn't explain why. After the call, I sat at my kitchen table for a while. Then I called Edgar. Pull out the Trillium shareholder agreement, I said, specifically Section 8.2 and Section 5.4. I want to confirm everything is still in effect. Edgar called back within the hour, all intact, no amendments, no motions to modify. You want me to action anything? Not yet, I said, just confirming. Then I sent an email, short and professional, to Bridget Ossie, the compliance and HR director at Trillium Baxter Construction. I'd met Bridget twice, once when the deal closed, once when she'd come up to Sudbury for an employee benefits review. She was methodical and thorough, and had the kind of presence that made you understand she took her responsibilities seriously. The email said, Bridget, I'll be attending next Friday's all hands in my capacity as retained interest holder. Per Section 8.2 and Section 5.4 of the shareholder agreement, please have the relevant ownership documentation available if required. Thank you. Her reply came back in 3 hours. Mr. Baxter, of course. I'll have everything ready. Nothing more, no questions, no alarm. That's when I understood something. Bridget had known exactly who I was from the day the deal closed. Her role was compliance and governance, and she reported directly to the board, not to Jarrett. She'd been sitting on that information, doing her job correctly, waiting for someone with standing to actually invoke it. Thursday evening, my phone rang. Vince Marchetti. Vince had been my site foreman since the second year of Baxter Site Solutions, the man I trusted with the jobs that mattered. He was the kind of person who showed up 20 minutes early and never once asked for anything he hadn't earned. Lionel, his voice was lower than usual. You hear about the efficiency review? I heard the outline. It's 36 positions, all field crew, equipment operators, site supervisors, the safety coordinators. He paused. Gus Fontaine, the Pelletier brothers, Marie-Claire Tremblay from Quality Control, people who've been here since it was still called Baxter Site Solutions, since before any of the Toronto people ever set foot on a job site. I knew those names. Gus had been operating a cat excavator for me since he was 24. Marie-Claire had started in admin and cross-trained herself into QC through sheer persistence. The Pelletier brothers, Luc and Andre, had been on the heavy equipment side so long they could grade a slope by instinct. The Trillium board provisionally approved it, Vince said. Jarrett's recommendation is drafted. It just needs one signature to go to implementation. I already knew what that meant. Section 8.2 was clear. 36 positions was more than 15. That clause had been in the agreement since the day we signed. Lionel, Vince said, is there anything you can do? I thought about Thanksgiving, about the table going quiet. I'm coming Friday, I said. After I hung up, I sat in the kitchen for a long time. I want to be honest with you. If my son-in-law had only said what he said at that Thanksgiving dinner, I might have let it go forever. I'd been letting things go for 2 years. But 36 people losing their jobs before Christmas is a different kind of calculation altogether. Friday morning, I was up at 5:30, same time I'd gotten up when I was running the company myself. I put on dark work pants and the charcoal flannel I'd had for 10 years, the one that still fits. I stopped at Tim Hortons on the way out of the city, large double-double, same as always, and drove the 2 hours south to Barrie, where Lionel Baxter Construction had its regional office. The building was in a business park off Bayfield Street, modern construction, landscaped entrance, the Lionel Baxter sign in brushed steel near the road. Nice sign, nothing wrong with it. But I had looked at that building's floor plan 2 years earlier when Trillium asked me to review their expansion proposal. The layout of the main floor, the conference wing, the way the loading access curved around the east side, all of that had come from specifications drawn out of the original job plans for a facility I'd designed in 2009. The sign was different. The rest of it was mine. I pulled into the lot 20 minutes early and sat in my truck, watched people arrive. Young professionals in down vests, a few faces I recognized from the Sudbury cruise, and then Vince crossing the parking lot in his steel toes, collar of his shirt not quite right on one side. He spotted my truck and walked over, knocked on the window. Didn't think you'd actually come, he said when I rolled it down. I said I would. He nodded. We walked in together. My son-in-law was in the lobby near the reception desk talking to a couple of junior managers. When we came through the door, something crossed his face. Surprise, maybe, or a quick recalculation. Oh, you actually made it. He glanced at Vince, then back at me. Grab a chair at the back, you'll get a feel for how things run now. Sure, I said. Walking in, I passed the same corridor where I'd once spent an afternoon going over safety protocols with a crew of 12, before Trillium had repainted it a different shade of gray. The plaques on the wall were new, the carpet was new, but every door, every exit, every corner of that building, I knew it. If you've ever walked back into something that used to be yours, you know exactly what that feels like. Drop a "been there" in the comments if you do. The conference room held 60 people comfortably. That morning it was standing room along the back wall. Vince and I took chairs at the end of the last row. A few people nodded at Vince. No one nodded at me. I was a stranger in a flannel shirt holding a Tim Hortons cup. My son-in-law stood at the front, clicker in hand, a slide deck behind him. He had the posture of someone who had practiced this. Shoulders squared, feet planted, pauses in the right places. He walked the room through Q3 results, solid numbers, good project margins, some wins on municipal tendering. The room stayed attentive and polite. Then a new slide appeared. Efficiency review, field workforce consolidation, clean blue headers, white background, serious font, 36 positions, all field crew and site operations. Effective February 1st. The room changed. I could feel it before I could see it. A shift in the quality of the silence. Someone in the middle section tilted slightly toward the person beside them. A few people looked down at their hands. I could see Gus Fontaine 2 rows ahead of me, the back of his neck. My son-in-law kept talking. Cost optimization, operational modernization, long-term competitiveness. The words came out smooth and well-rehearsed, and I had no doubt he believed every one of them. Then he looked up from the slide, scanned the room the way he always did, and found me at the back. A small smile. Since we have a guest with us today, he gestured toward me, easy, almost generous. Why don't you come up here? Give us a traditional perspective. Get a real conversation going. He meant it as a demonstration, an object lesson, a chance to show the room how thoroughly he understood what I apparently didn't. I stood up, walked to the front. He handed me the microphone the way a man does when he believes he controls the room. I held it, took a breath, looked at all 60 faces turned my direction. Vince near the back wall, Gus Fontaine 3 rows in, Marie-Claire Tremblay on the left side, hands folded. 2 of my son-in-law's junior managers near the front, already composing politely, skeptical expressions, ready for the old-timer speech they assumed was coming. I looked at my son-in-law. Before I respond to your question, I said, can you tell the room who holds final approval authority on any field workforce reduction under the shareholder agreement? A beat of silence. He tilted his head. That would be the Trillium Board, obviously. I turned toward the side wall where Bridget Ozzie was seated, laptop open in front of her. Bridget, would you pull up section 8.2 of the shareholder agreement, please, and put it on the screen? My son-in-law straightened. What? Why would you? You invited me up here to be transparent, I said. Let's be transparent. Bridget's fingers moved on the keyboard, without a moment's hesitation. The slide deck behind him went dark. In its place, a PDF document appeared. White pages, black text, the kind of formatting that belongs to lawyers and binding agreements. The room went completely still. My son-in-law turned to look at the screen, then at Bridget, then at me. The ventilation system hummed. One person coughed once, then stopped. Bridget scrolled to section 8.2. It filled the screen behind his head. Section 8.2, Workforce Reduction Threshold. Any reduction in active field workforce exceeding 15 positions requires prior written consent from the retained interest holder, Lionel J. Baxter, whose 35% retained interest carries veto authority over payroll and field staffing decisions. She scrolled slightly. Section 5.4, Payroll Authorization. Payroll disbursement authority over field positions remains with the retained interest holder until a full equity buyout is executed per the terms set out in Schedule B. A young woman near the center of the room turned to the man beside her and said something too quiet to hear. He shook his head slowly. One of my son-in-law's junior managers looked down at the table. Then, from the back of the room, in a voice that wasn't loud but carried cleanly across that space, Vince Marchetti said, "That's the man who built this company." And the room understood. 30 seconds of silence. Then someone near the middle began to clap. One set of hands, then a few more. It wasn't a standing ovation. It was the sound of people who'd been holding something tightly and finally had somewhere to put it down. I let the applause finish. To answer your original question, I said, I don't see value in eliminating 36 field positions that can be absorbed over 18 months through phased cross-training and natural attrition. I'd like to present that plan to the room, if people are willing. No one said they weren't. The meeting ran another 45 minutes. I walked through a transition framework I'd drafted in the 3 weeks since Vince first raised the alarm. My advisory board seat gave me access to the field operations data, and I'd had enough of it to know that the numbers my son-in-law was using were real, but his conclusion was premature. The cross-training path was longer. It was more expensive in the short term, but it kept 36 families in the Sudbury Basin intact. People asked real questions, I answered them. My son-in-law stood to the side for most of it with his arms folded, saying nothing. Afterward, as the room cleared, he found me near the door. He took my arm, not rough, but deliberate, and stepped us 2 feet away from the foot traffic. What the hell was that? His voice was controlled, low. You put me on stage, I said. You blindsided me in front of my entire team. You invited me. This is good to come back on Simone. Simone can call me. I'll be home before 4. He had nothing for that. A couple of his managers passed us in the corridor. They looked at the floor. I turned away from him, walked back into the conference room, and shook Vince's hand. Found Gus Fontaine by the window and shook his. Marie-Claire Tremblay put her hand out and held it a second longer than necessary. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. I walked out through the lobby, through the glass doors, and into the November air. Got in my truck. Drove home. Simone called at 6:12 that evening. I was at the kitchen table eating leftover soup. Dad. Her voice had the tightness of someone who'd been crying and decided to stop. He's really upset. He worked hard on that presentation. I set down my spoon. 36 people in the Sudbury Basin are keeping their jobs this week. A long silence. Why didn't you just tell him? She said. You could have said something at the beginning. You asked me not to complicate things, I said. I honored that. That's not, she stopped. That's not fair. Maybe not, I said, but it's what happened. Another silence. I could hear her breathing. He never once asked, I said. Not about the company, not about what it cost to build it, not about your mother, not once in 3 years. The line stayed quiet for a long time. Then Simone said very softly, I know. I waited. I need a couple of days, she said. I love you. I love you too, I said. I'm here when you're ready. I hung up and sat at the kitchen table. The same table where Anne and I had eaten every meal for 19 years. The same table where I'd told Simone about her mother's diagnosis. Where she'd done homework. Where she'd first told me about Jarrett, with that higher-pitched voice. I sat there until the soup went cold. I didn't doubt what I'd done. But I want you to understand. Being right and being at peace are not the same thing, and sometimes the distance between them is longer than any drive north on the 400 at night. Monday morning, Richard Fong, managing partner at Trillium Infrastructure, called me. His voice was measured. The kind of careful that comes from spending a weekend with legal counsel. Mr. Baxter, we've reviewed Section 8.2 and Section 5.4 of the shareholder agreement thoroughly. We were not fully aware of the scope of your retained authority. I understand, I said. We'd like to invite you to a formal board meeting, in your capacity as retained interest holder, not as a family guest. A pause. We should have done this sooner. Yes, I said. You should have. The meeting was the following week. I wore the same dark work pants and a slightly nicer flannel because I didn't own a suit and I wasn't about to buy one for the occasion. My son-in-law was there. He presented the efficiency review to a board that had now read the fine print. They didn't reject his plan outright. Trillium is not a sentimental organization, and they're not wrong that the operation needs to modernize. But they required him to incorporate my transition framework as the primary restructuring approach, pending my written consent. He shook my hand at the end of the meeting, firm grip, eyes moving. Good presentation, I said. He nodded once and left. The VP operations nomination, I learned later from Edgar, was put on indefinite hold pending what the board called stakeholder alignment. That's the corporate phrase for what happens when a board realizes they've been working around someone they should have been working with from the start. 36 positions still standing. 5 weeks after the all-hands, Simone showed up at my door on a Wednesday evening. No call ahead. She stood on the porch in her winter coat, hands in her pockets, snow just starting to come down behind her. I opened the door, and she came inside, and we sat at the kitchen table. I made tea. She didn't say anything for a while. I've been thinking about what you said, she finally offered, that he never asked. I poured her a cup and sat across from her. He doesn't know anything about you, Dad. Not really. He knows you ran a construction company and sold it. He's never asked what it took. He's never asked about Mom. She looked at the table. I think I stopped asking too, about what you were carrying. That's not your responsibility. I think some of it is. She met my eyes. I kept asking you to make yourself smaller so he wouldn't feel threatened. I didn't confirm or deny it. She already knew. I put my hand on hers and we sat like that for a while, just the refrigerator humming and the snow ticking against the kitchen window. The following weekend, Max called me from Simone's phone. 8 years old and already braver than most adults I know. Grandpa, he said, Dad says you own the company. Is that true? I thought for a moment about how to answer that. I used to own it, Bud, I said. Now I mostly make sure people are treated right. Oh, he said. That sounds like a pretty good job. Yeah, I said. It really does. 2 weeks later, a card arrived in the mail. Postmarked Garson, which is the kind of detail that tells you everything. Inside, a photo, Gus Fontaine, his wife, 3 kids in matching snowsuits standing in front of what looked like a backyard rink. His handwriting on the back, still here because of you. Merry Christmas. I put it on the refrigerator, right next to the old photo of Anne. Here's what I've had time to think about since all of this happened. I didn't walk into that conference room to embarrass my son-in-law. I walked in because 36 families in Northern Ontario needed someone with standing to use it. The fact that the truth also happened to answer 2 years of dinner table condescension. That wasn't my design. That was just the math working out the way honest math eventually does. My son-in-law is still at Trillium Baxter. His plan wasn't entirely wrong. The company does need to modernize, And he's not a stupid man. He's a man who confused credentials with wisdom and education with authority. Those are mistakes a person can recover from if they're willing to look at them honestly. I notified him and the board by email, brief, professional, that I would be attending quarterly board meetings going forward in my capacity as retained interest holder, not as a family guest. He didn't reply. Simone says he's been quieter at home. I don't know what that means for them yet, and it's not my place to decide. What I know is this. I built that company with my hands and my credit and 2 decades of 5:30 mornings in northern Ontario winters. I never needed my son-in-law to acknowledge that, but 36 people deserved to know that someone was still paying attention. He said he'd never hire someone like me. He cashed every check I signed. That's the story. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't make threats. I didn't bring it up at the dinner table. I showed up, let the paperwork speak, and drove home the same way I came in. Now I want to hear from you. Have you ever been in a room where someone looked right past you, and you had to decide whether to correct them or let it ride? Leave that in the comments. Tell me what you chose. If this story found you at the right moment, share it with someone who needs it today.